So welcome, good afternoon to everyone. Good morning for those of you who are on different time zones as myself. It's 5 a.m. here, so it's a little bit early. So yes, I'm going to talk to you about including learner diversity in large class teaching using universal design for learning to sustain a systemic approach to the reflection on social justice and accessibility. Okay, it's doing this again, not wanting to. Okay, let me just share again. Usually that's the problem. Sorry. Learn from many experiences on Zoom doing this virtually. It should work the second time around. There we go. I'll start with a quick line acknowledgement. Acknowledge that I have the pleasure of working, living, and playing on the unceded and traditional territories of the PHELC people. And in front of you, I have an image of the Okanagan Valley. This is the other name of the region in which I live. The objectives for today, and we've got a very short session, as you know, even though it's a keynote, but we'll have time for questions afterwards. So I'd like to visit two myths which are commonly perpetuated in the large classroom context. And these two myths are, first of all, that EDIs, equity, diversity, inclusion objectives, are best achieved outside the classroom in the sort of neoliberal landscapes in which we are, where the classrooms can be large. And secondly, that UDL and other inclusive frameworks are too challenging to implement in these large classrooms. So two myths which I find, and I will explain my stance in a minute, I found are perpetuated quite frequently in this context. And then quickly, if we have time allowed, we'll assess the impact as well of the COVID crisis on these perpetuated beliefs, and then present a call for action for a wider, richer literature. This is a call to action to all of you to see that we fill the gap in the literature that exists at the moment around these themes, because I will argue that that's the way we will debunk this myth, is by widening the literature that actually surrounds these two topics. So quickly, my personal lens, in this paper, I use autoethnography as a methodological research. I'm faculty now. I've been faculty for about 8 years, but I was previously for 4 years head of accessibility on a very large Canadian campus where we were driving a UDL momentum fairly hard. And within that work, I had the opportunity to support and advise instructors who were working in large classrooms. Particularly, I'm going to make reference several times to a Psych 101 course, which in this institution was often over 1,200 students. So some of the parameters that we have to navigate in supporting instructors teach a course of that size. And I was compelled to develop specific PD and specific sessions for these instructors, and this is really what I revisit for the purpose of this paper. So the large classroom, why the large classroom? I think it's important right away to assess and acknowledge the fact that the large classroom is a response to the realities of neoliberal, so the neoliberal higher education landscape. This has been going on now for a number of decades. Really, we can trace it back to really both Reagan in the US and Thatcher in the UK, and really dragging education firmly into the business world, into a business model. And within that model, as I write there, things quality and success are measured in terms of high admission rates, effective retention of a large student demographic, and successful graduation of large cohorts. And the subtext there is that the key objective is financial sustainability. And the large classroom obviously represents a powerful tool. We all understand this, you're all part of this equation. Few instructors, larger classrooms is a recipe for this sort of financial sustainability. Now,
Frederic, we've lost you there. Sorry.
That's all right.
Frederic, just 1 second.
Go back a little bit, or
you just no. Just 1 second, Frederic.
Yeah.
Not is here.
I don't know why.
No, it's this laptop here.
And you didn't touch it, so it went to Frederic.
No, I don't think it's us. Sorry.
The comments are coming in saying it's clear online.
Oh, okay. It's just that. Okay, Frederic, you can be heard online, but you can't be heard in the
okay,
screen.
can you hear me now?
Please give us a second. The screen.
Have I signed out or something? Would that be it?
That's not on mute.
No, it's not on mute.
Frederic, can you just keep
you speak just check.
Yes, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you. Sorry.
That's all right. So we'll go back to which part. When did you cut off? Did we go through this slide or?
Just while you were on the slide, we realized very quickly.
Okay, so again, the large classroom responds to neoliberal realities of a neoliberal higher education landscape, where again, I said this is, higher education has been dragged into this model since Reagan in the US and Thatcher in the UK, so several decades, where success is measured again in high admission rates, effective retention of large student demographics, and it's a successful graduation of large cohorts. And the subtext I was saying there is financial sustainability. And I was explaining, really asking you to acknowledge the fact that all of you as instructors in large classroom are part of this equation, where few instructors, larger classroom, obviously is the recipe from a business model to higher financial sustainability. So what I wanted to make sure and make clear from this onset is that the problem of this paper is not to argue against neoliberalism in higher ed. We live with it. That's what I'm going to argue. It's here to stay. I don't think that we're going to really change that. And the most subtle and nuanced question I found at the moment is within that neoliberal environment and within that large class context, how can educators still focus on social justice, learner diversity, accessibility, and the lived experience of minorities in frameworks that prioritize numbers over the personalization of the classroom. And many will argue that it's impossible. So this is what we're looking at today, is within this context that we can't really change, how can we do the best job we can at accessibility, inclusion, etc., and recognizing learner diversity? So the first myth, and I'm very conscious of time here. So the first myth I wanted to tackle, because I've seen this perpetuated by instructors who teach on previous campuses where I've been able to support through UDL and teaching and learning, is really something that we often hear, that equity, diversity, and inclusion objectives, even when they're embraced by higher education campuses, are often seen as being best served outside the classroom. So we have this equation where really we're telling instructors, well, you've got a large classroom, this is the model that's going to work, make it work. And yes, we want to attract diverse learners, but we will take care of diversity, we will take care of learner diversity outside the classroom. So just teach, and we will actually make sure that the mindset and the culture of the campus is changing. It's actually quite a pervasive sort of both belief and objective that we see perpetuated at the moment. And it's tricky. So first of all, I think we're going to state, I think right away, there's a certain irony, because EDI has become, inclusion, accessibility have become key parts of the branding of our campuses. So we actually attract these large numbers by saying we actually are focused on diverse learners. And then we have this sort of contradictory ambivalent language where we say, okay, now you're on our campus, but we can't really change the pedagogy. We can't really deal at this stage with EDI in the classroom, but we're going to make sure that student services and student affairs are actually, creating a landscape and a mindset within the campus that's actually open to learner diversity. And really the subtext is, again, that really these diverse learners are going to experience barriers, but they're going to experience them in their residency living conditions, social interactions, on their campus interactions. Whereas really for us, it's really manifest that the barriers that these learners actually experience are in the classroom themselves. And here I think we need to really sort of be conscious of intersectionality and of the commonalities when we carry out a barriers analysis, which is what inclusive design mindset is about. We realize that really, whether it's lifelong learners, whether it's first generation students, whether it is second language learners, international students, whether it's learners with disabilities, or whether it's racialized students, LGBTQ2S+ students, they actually, if you take the time to be really ethnographic and to look at the barriers that these students experience, there's a lot of commonalities. These are not, a series of groups of diverse learners who experience their own specific barriers. They all experience pretty much the same. And unfortunately, in our student services and student affairs approach, we've perpetuated this notion that as long as there's support officers to support each of these groups outside the classroom, it'll be okay. And we're not necessarily accepting the fact that, in fact, most of the barriers are actually common and they happen in the classroom. They are actually about access to learning. So again, a certain irony here in a sense that within the, and I want to stress that within the neoliberal environment, all campuses at the moment are branding themselves and positioning themselves on the market by saying, we want to attract these diverse learners. So you can see the tension there when we're saying, this is one of our key features. Oh, but we don't want to touch pedagogy, right? For pedagogy purposes, we're still talking about economies of scales. Let's do the best job we can with this very large classroom, and we'll do the rest outside of the classroom. Obviously, that's not going to work, and so it is a call to really, I think, acknowledge, pop the the bubble, and acknowledge within ourselves, with our colleagues in our institutions, that really, if EDI is going to become a reality, it needs to dribble down. It needs to penetrate pedagogy itself and our reflection on pedagogy. And how are we going to do that? Well, that's why I think it is important to argue that it's inclusive mindset, inclusive design mindset that are going to do the work. It's not going to be able to be carried just by student affairs and student services. It is actually about teaching and learning. So then we get to the second myth, that when you get people to accept this, they then usually say, well, yes, I know about inclusive mindset, particularly interested in UDL. I've tried it sometimes, but I can't do it in a large classroom because really, again, economies of scales means that, there's pockets of opportunity, but this is not one of the pockets of opportunities. And we've got to be careful of this, because even the UDL discourse is very quick to say, do it when you can, do it when there's an opportunity. And so that opens the door for a lot of instructors to say, well, when I'm teaching that grad class with 30 students, I'll do my best at UDL. But when I'm teaching that huge class, of 1,000 in undergrad as a 101 course, I don't, it's not going to be my priority. So how do we get people to really go over that, that sort of hurdle? I would actually say that it can be argued that UDL integration is not just pertinent, but it's urgent in large classroom. And here I would take you back really to the experiences I've had with this Psych 101 course that was over 1,200 students on most years. I would argue that actually the experiences I've had with these instructors was that they were the first to admit the traditional model is broken. I cannot teach a class of 1,200 in a traditional way. Often there were not even enough seating available for students in the classroom. Even if they were able to enter the classroom, they were not able to see the instructor. Often they were not able to hear clearly the instructor. So right away, there was this sort of shift of saying, I have to give up trying to do this traditionally. I have to redesign. I have to actually think about the user experience and work from the user experience and rebuild my understanding of particularly the lecture format, the traditional lecture format. What will I do with it? How will I recreate it? And particularly summative assessment. I think we've all come to realize that when you're doing summative assessment, yes, there's that tipping point where, and you have a lot of arguments from, the 30 to 100, when you say economies of scale, I'm defaulting back to summative assessment because it saves me time. But over the 100 mark, you suddenly realize the hurdles of it itself, that even as a quick fix, it doesn't give you any sort of window into the learner competencies. So therefore, I think there comes a point that where it becomes abandoned. So I would argue again to try and work with these instructors from that feeling of frustration, because my experience is that all educators that work in large classes have had that experience of frustration, and to really take that opportunity as a rich ground to get people really involved in inclusive design thinking, because that's where it is happening from that position of need. I think when we talk about UDL generally, if it's a luxury, it's really hard to pitch as a, to sell to people, because we've been bombarded by different framework. But when you get to that point of need, when an instructor will say, I don't have a choice, this is no longer working, nothing else is working, that's where there's really an opportunity for UDL to be really appealing and to get some really genuine buy-in. So why? Because it's user-friendly, it's consistent, and it's solid lens to carry out the redesign that we need to do in the large classroom. Now, there's a challenge here, but it's also an opportunity. Another experience which I've had when I've worked as accessibility in working with large instructors that were working in large classroom is that at times you have people who will say, oh, I didn't know that was UDL. So sometimes it's the discourse itself that they've never been exposed to. But there's an opportunity there. A lot of people in large classroom have been designing their own, intuitively designing their own way forward, their own redesign, but they've been lacking that framework. They've been lacking, the literature and the scholarship to be able to realize it's not just their work, but it actually connects with other people's work, and is now an international dialogue around that model. I can think, for example, of a colleague at McGill who was a prize-winning educator, always teaching a large science classroom. And a simple thing that she had realized about representation, so giving information to learner, was that really just giving the slides wasn't enough. So she would give the prior slides, to the whole class. She would actually set up note-taking groups within the classroom so that students were taking turns in providing notes to each other. And then she was taking her own notes while she was teaching, and then also sending that out to the students. So 3 different ways of accessing the course content and creating notes from classroom. She had never heard of UDL, but what she was doing was really UDL working from an inclusive mindset in terms of design. She was lacking that support of knowing that she wasn't alone, there are other people doing that work, and there was a scholarship to tap into. So one of the problems is that there's a real failure to document these initiatives. I would argue that in large classroom, that's probably where we see, and this is where I'm really debunking the myth, this is probably where we see the best UDL work. But we don't necessarily see the literature that accompanies those field initiatives. Well, why? One reason is obvious. Those large instructors usually are the ones that are feeling the most the pressure in terms of workload, and often they don't have time to publish this initiative. They're busy enough doing it that they don't have time to actually carry this to publication. There's some encouraging exception, and Marie is one of them, and published a book chapter in a book I edited last year. So this presentation is also a call for action, that we have a collective responsibility to document these incredible things that we're doing in large classroom, because I think it is actually the selling point for UDL. It is the convincing argument for other people to come on board. But we have to go beyond just doing it, and we have to go to the point of actually documenting this. I'm conscious of time, but just to finish, I did want to wrap around the notion, our reflection around the COVID crisis. I think the COVID crisis generally has been really important in getting educators to accept and acknowledge and embrace the fact that they actually are designers. Before that, in most of the UDL work I was doing, we were getting instructors very reluctant to accept that hat and saying, I teach, I'm a content expert, I don't do design, I've never been trained to design. Well, the online pivot has made everyone realize that we are all designers, and bad design has an immediate impact on user experience. So that's been really important for all instructors across the board. But there's also, I think, been a lot of commonalities and experiences when these traditional instructors working in small classroom have pivoted to online. They have suddenly hit some of the challenges that other instructors were having for a long time because they were working in large classroom. So suddenly we have a shared experience there. And that, again, is an opportunity for a lot of dialogue and a lot of large-scale reflection on transforming pedagogy. One of those particularly is the limits of summative assessment. Again, you have a lot of instructors, I think, in higher ed in that sort of class size of 30 to 100 who defaulting back to summative assessment, but have realized that going online, it wasn't working. You've all heard the debacle on proctoral services, etc. Realizing that really there was no way of just taking those summative exams as finals and taking them online. It wasn't working. And that's a realization that I think a lot of instructors in large classroom contexts had already had. So a lot of commonalities, a lot of opportunities for dialogue there, which is going to be really important, I think, in the future. We've got to realize as well. So really, one last thought here is that I would argue that we need catalysts to really trigger our pedagogical change. We don't change our teaching and learning just because we feel like it. Often there needs to be a feeling of urgency, and I think that's what there's been a moment of sharing here, is that instructors in large classroom have had that urgency for a long time. They know things need to change and traditional models don't work. And now we have even the small classroom instructors who, because they've moved to online overnight, have realized the limitations of their usual practices and the practices they perpetuate. So that feeling of urgency and shared feeling of urgency is really interesting, and I think we can capitalize on that. Now, as a background, accept and acknowledge the fact as well that the model has remained business as usual despite exceptional hurdles. So that's the other commonality that we have, this notion of having to reinvent when really all the other sort of benchmarking and all the other sort of quality assurance have stayed the same. in terms of revenue preservation, class size, context of urgency. We've been told it's business as usual, make it work, right? So that has been a really important work. It's walking that tightrope in the middle of this really challenging neoliberal environment, and that's something that now everyone has felt. Now, obviously, I think it's also important to acknowledge the fact that the large class, the difficulties in the large classroom in terms of diversity has been exacerbated during the crisis, and I think we need to acknowledge that too. Particularly, I'm thinking here in terms of international students. It's one thing to have a large class and to be redesigning, but when, for example, half of your class size is on different time zones, such as I am now, and you're trying to do things, but it's 2 in the morning, that has been a difficulty that we've never had to deal before, because at least before we had people in the same time zone, even if we had some flexibility into how we interacted with them, etc. So I think we're taking the questions at the end. I'll leave it there, but I'm looking forward to the session, and maybe we can take questions at the end when we all get together again.